Resident Evil 4 Remilk is the worst Resident Evil title I've ever played, the worst remake of a game I've ever played, and the worst title I've ever played in my entire life as a gamer. And I mean that with a passion, as a true Resident Evil player. After Resident Evil 2 Remilk started the trend with bad Resident Evil games, and Resident Evil Village's developers demonstrated a lot of confusion with designing the story and gameplay for most of Resident Evil Village, Resident Evil 4 Remilk unfortunately followed that same downward trend, only with a much steeper decline in quality. The team behind this botched up mess of a remake have redefined what it means to be an incompetent development team by setting a brand new baseline in incompetency. I can't even bring myself to call Resident Evil 4 Remilk a game, let alone a remake, as it is of such poor, soulless quality to the point of feeling like a pre-alpha with some of the most amateurish mistakes I have ever seen in a AAA title. And no, when I call this a pre-alpha, I'm not talking about in relation to Gollum or that Kong game that have become meme sensations with their incredibly unfinished designs that are noticeable at the surface, or with Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League with its false ideas on what being a game is. Resident Evil 4 Remilk, from the context of a pre-alpha, has nothing to do with bugs or glitches. It is a AAA title that has flaws so huge as a result of intended design choices that it fundamentally compromises the entire game experience. Yet these gameplay problems aren't so easily recognizable in the layman's eyes. And it's not just the gameplay that's the issue. The story, characters, screenplay, and writing are also below subpar quality. It is to the point where you have to wonder if the developers even played the original Resident Evil 4 or took designs from another title and applied it to Resident Evil 4 Remilk. This pre-alpha makes so much of a mockery of the original Resident Evil 4 that it makes no sense why it has received universal acclaim. The DLC is no different, with Separate Ways Remilk being the worst Resident Evil DLC I've ever played. And I know I'm going to see the dislikes skyrocket, assuming this retrospective gets prioritized in YouTube's algorithms. And I know the comments are probably going to be littered with the obligatory, "Why do you play a title you hate?" or other dumb comments on par with that, but I'm not going to waste time addressing those idiots in the comments, since they don't care to listen or are too hypocritical, making it impossible to take them seriously. And I'm sure those people have already clicked off this video by now, so screw them. But to those who are still sticking around for this entire retrospective, much like what I did with my Resident Evil Village retrospective and my Shed as a Rose DLC retrospective, I will guide you from start to finish, addressing the mishaps with the story, characters, gameplay, screenplay, and writing for Resident Evil 4 Remilk, and then for Separate Ways Remilk. And hopefully, I'll also be able to educate you on additional details related to Resident Evil 4 OG's lore. I guess in a way, this is not only a retrospective on Resident Evil 4 Remilk and Separate Ways Remilk, but also on Resident Evil 4 OG and Separate Ways OG. This is going to be very interesting. With all that said, let's get into this train wreck of a Resident Evil title. This is going to be a pretty lopsided review / retrospective, but it's fitting for complementing a very lopsided Resident Evil title. But before we get into this, I can't not talk about the chainsaw demo for Resident Evil 4 Remilk. Even before Resident Evil 4 Remilk released, I already knew such extremely poor quality would be readily apparent throughout its entirety thanks to this demo. The chainsaw demo allowed you to play from the start of Chapter 1 all the way to the iconic village encounter. For some reason, New Capcom decided to not take the same approach as Resident Evil 2 Remilk and Resident Evil Village, where they opted for timed demos. They instead chose not to make the chainsaw demo a timed demo. I already lambasted this practice of timed demos back in my Resident Evil Village retrospective, but New Capcom clearly took the feedback from how poorly handled the Resident Evil Village timed demos were and favored the standard demo format. I'm praising the developers for favoring the normal model of demos with Resident Evil 4 Remilk. But that's the only positive I can give this demo. Too bad it does a poor job at putting Resident Evil 4 Remilk in a better light. There were numerous gameplay issues and improper mentalities that I found in this demo, problems that would be preserved in the main experience. I'll talk about these problems when I get to that part. Having these problems be preserved in the final product was not surprising to me, as the Resident Evil demos since 2019 have always worked by taking a slice of the final product and putting it into the demo. The RPD demo from Resident Evil 2 Remilk, the Raccoon City demo from Resident Evil 3 Remilk, and the Village and Castle demos from Resident Evil Village are one-to-one with the final version, minus some collectibles and cutscenes only found in the demos. This should be obvious to anyone who has actually kept up with the Resident Evil demos and played their corresponding final product versions, read developer news on the demos, and kept up with other Resident Evil news. But unfortunately, what should be common knowledge is apparently not common knowledge, as my video titled Resident Evil 4 Remilk is shaping up to be the worst remake I've ever played received a huge amount of dislikes, and so many people kept calling me an idiot for thinking the demo was representative of the main experience and they couldn't take my commentary seriously. They also said that these so-called issues would be fixed in the final version. Guess it really goes to show how many brain cells these people have. If they seriously think such issues could be fixed in a matter of weeks, they have no understanding of how game design works. Also, people had early access to Resident Evil 4 Remilk before it ever released, so this was further confirmation that new Capcom was not going to fix anything. Do I really need to say more? But going back to that video, ironically, I hadn't even intended for it to be viewed by such a large audience, as back then, my channel was obscure. The fact that I got such a large viewing out of the blue was surprising. I guess I can give this pre-alpha credit where it's due. Because of Resident Evil 4's popularity in gaming, the mainstream audience overly praising this pre-alpha, and how I was an outlier amid such overwhelming praise, such a large viewing was bound to happen sooner or later. But to sum it all up, the Chainsaw demo left an incredibly sour taste in my mouth, and it didn't help that Mad Chainsaw mode, the secret difficulty mode in the Chainsaw demo, was using poor gameplay designs for the foundations of its difficulty. Designs that would ultimately transfer into hardcore and professional difficulty of the final version. I'll talk more about that later on, but having said all that, let's finally get into Resident Evil 4 Remilk. Or at least the title screen of Resident Evil 4 Remilk, because there is something I need to point out. Remember how in Resident Evil Village, when you viewed the concept art, you got detailed information on certain story moments? What was going through the developers' heads when designing certain environments, characters, and story moments? What development of Resident Evil Village was like, what development of Resident Evil 7 was like, etc. Well, in Resident Evil 4 Remilk, all of that is lost in the concept art. If there was ever an indication that the developers didn't understand Resident Evil 4's lore, or any indication of where their priorities were when designing this pre-alpha, this is rather conspicuous. One of the main things that new Capcom promised before Resident Evil 4 Remilk was released was that the original story would receive some much-needed improvements. You see, in an interview, Shinji Mikami, the original director of Resident Evil 4 OG, acknowledged that the story of Resident Evil 4 OG was constructed over the span of 2 weeks, and they ran out of time to contribute further to the story. I believe Separate Ways OG releasing on the PS2 version after the initial launch of the GameCube version of Resident Evil 4 OG represented attempts by the developers to further contribute to the story after initial development was done. As such, this apparently informed new Capcom's promise of improved storytelling to fans. I say apparently because the story in Resident Evil 4 Remilk feels like it was constructed over the span of a few hours, and the supposed improvements to the story are actually mockeries and over-exaggerations of certain details. It can really feel like a fan fiction at many points, not a cohesive story designed by experienced developers. The same goes for Separate Ways Remilk story, but the cuts to the story of the DLC is only made more conspicuous by the fact that they removed Ada's reports entirely. You see, in Separate Ways OG, the inclusion of Ada's reports made the story front and center. We were able to get additional insight into Luis, Leon, Wesker's plans, the rival organization, the primary reason why Ada is infiltrating the Illuminados, and even Tricell from Resident Evil 5. Cutting them in Separate Ways Remilk goes to show how bad the story is. These issues will be described further when I get to them. But if the story was such a priority in new Capcom's eyes, why didn't they take a cue from Resident Evil Village when designing the concept art, and instead opted to make the concept art devoid of any details? Keep this question in mind as we go through this pre-alpha, which we'll actually get into this time. When we start this pre-alpha, we get a cutscene of a girl being sacrificed by the Illuminados. I don't understand the point of this cutscene. It's clearly not Ashley, as she's one of the main characters. I assume this is one of those hikers kidnapped by the Illuminados, but all we need to know is that they've gone missing. We don't need this scene at all, much like the intro to the first scenario in Resident Evil 2 Remilk, with that truck driver eating a burger. And why did the Illuminados choose to sacrifice this girl rather than infect her with the Plaga? This is a question I pondered in Separate Ways OG as well. In Separate Ways OG, the Ganados chose to sacrifice Ada, but that was before they realized her connection to Luis Serra, and I was hoping this question would be answered in the Remilk, but it's not. And it's funny, because in Separate Ways Remilk, there is a file that mentions not to, quote, slay outsiders at will. All people have the right to fair judgment, which is such a stupid piece of lore, as the Plagas don't care about justice. They care about spreading and procreating. Why would fair judgment matter in this case? What were the developers thinking with this file? Am I supposed to believe this girl was judged and she received a death sentence for some reason? The only kind of answer I've been given to these questions is from the Resident Evil podcast team, who believe that based on Illuminados 4.3, the villagers needed to sacrifice crops, animals, and people to Sadler in a sort of Wicker Man scenario that promotes healthy crops and repel famine and pestilence. When outsiders are found, they're used instead of anything related to the villagers, so these sacrifices have nothing to do with the Plaga. This girl was probably an outsider that wandered into the village and was therefore used in the ritual as part of Illuminados 4.3. Whether she received judgment or not prior to this ritual is unclear, especially when considering that the final page in the file titled Village Records Volume 3 doesn't list a specific date as to when the outsiders listed here were killed. The exact time when the Illuminados decided not to slay outsiders recklessly is unclear. While this may make sense, it only justifies how pointless the sacrifice scene is if it has nothing to do with the Plaga. After that completely pointless sacrifice scene, we finally get to Leon's introduction, and we can draw our first comparison between Resident Evil 4 OG and Resident Evil 4 Remilk to showcase the difference in the developers' priorities. In Resident Evil 4 OG, the introduction isn't framed so much around Leon. There's clearly intent by the developers to link back to the prior Resident Evil games in order to set up the status quo for Resident Evil 4 OG. Leon talks about key events like the murders in the Arklay Mountains that set up the events of Resident Evil 1 Remilk, the Raccoon City incident that occurred during Resident Evil 2 OG and Resident Evil 3 OG, and Operation Bacillus Terminate, which was the thermobaric missile strike that destroyed Raccoon City. The intro even used scenes from Resident Evil 3 OG, even though Leon isn't in that game. He then talks about the collapse of Umbrella, ending the introduction. Just based on these scenes alone, you can tell that Resident Evil 4 OG's story is not framed to be a character-centric story. It's framed to be part of an overarching narrative. They wanted to continue the story that they set up in Resident Evil 1 Remilk. In Resident Evil 4 Remilk, the context for this introduction is completely different, as it's now framed around Leon instead of an overarching narrative. Though, to be fair, given the lack of story and lack of deep lore in Resident Evil 2 Remilk and Resident Evil 3 Remilk, it would be hard to frame this intro around an overarching narrative. And I guess if the Remilk timeline is not canon, then I guess this would only inform a more character-centric story. That being said, they still go out of their way to reference the events of Resident Evil 2 Remilk, and I can't help but feel like the focus on a character-centric story only served to make New Capcom not care about their own lore and favor very confusing or outrageous scenarios with the Plagas. These confusing and outrageous scenarios with the Plagas will be elaborated on later. And it also doesn't help that in order to give the illusion of development with Leon's character, they have to make him act out of character initially, which is really dumb writing, but that will also be elaborated on further. In Resident Evil 4 Remilk's introduction, Leon talks about the events of Raccoon City, which took place on September 30th, 1998. He doesn't talk about the murders that took place in the Arklay Mountains, though the developers still showed trees that are clearly meant to showcase the landscape of the Arklay Mountains. So clearly, Resident Evil 1 Remilk has no connection to this Remilk timeline starting with Resident Evil 2 Remilk. He then says that the cop inside him died that day, and that Raccoon City was wiped out by Umbrella's bioweapons. It still bugs me to this day that these Remilks don't insist on using the term BOWs, instead of such a layman term like bioweapons. It feels disconnecting to the universe of Resident Evil if the term BOWs is not used, and the last Resident Evil media where the term BOWs was used was in Resident Evil Vendetta, which was released back in 2017, so it's been almost 6 years since that term was used. And yes, I'm well aware that Resident Evil Infinite Darkness uses the term, but only twice, so I'd hardly call it applicable. Leon then says that while he somehow made it out, so many others were unlucky. He was then asked to join a top-secret government program with no choice in the matter. In the canon timeline, it was Adam Benford who questioned Leon in Resident Evil The Dark Side Chronicles, when Leon was detained by the US government after escaping from Raccoon City. Leon was then made a part of Adam's clandestine group in the fight against bioterrorism. Leon and Adam maintained a close friendship over the years fighting BOWs, with Leon even divulging his survivor's guilt to Adam, and how he wanted to pull the trigger on himself, which led to Adam consoling Leon. I find it very odd that for this Remilk timeline, New Capcom decided to not include Adam Benford. I'll explain later on. Leon then summarizes how he went through training and punishing missions that nearly killed him, but they helped to take his mind off his traumas. Now, this part is confusing because it makes it seem like he went on missions that had nothing to do with BOWs. In the canon timeline, Leon's missions had to do with BOWs entirely, which makes sense as he had first-hand exposure to the threat of BOWs. His support would be paramount to other soldiers who had never faced the threat of BOWs. It's like in Resident Evil Vendetta, where Chris Redfield aided the Mexican GAFE in apprehending Glenn Arias as intel found that Arias was in possession of BOWs. His support was needed due to his first-hand exposure to BOWs. But in the Remilk timeline, Leon is just put on random missions that have nothing to do with BOWs, which is odd considering the US Army is already handling such missions. Why would a top-secret government program be handling such missions if their entire focus is around BOWs? And on top of this, Krauser is shown in this introduction as well, and he's been retconned to be Leon's mentor instead of a close ally. Now, this is a very bizarre choice, and I'll elaborate on this later on, as Krauser is characterized so poorly in Resident Evil 4 Remilk. And it seems odd that they would just casually show Krauser here and not have Leon mention him if he's been retconned to be Leon's mentor, someone with a seemingly high level of prominence in Leon's mind. This really comes across as a warning sign for how the developers will handle Krauser later on. Leon then finally concludes his introduction with a meme-worthy statement.
If I could just forget what happened that night. The pain. Even for a second. This time, it can be different.
What pain?
So, are you guys like boyfriend and girlfriend?
No, we're just... well, we actually just met last night.
Yeah. That would have been one hell of a first date, though.
Yeah, you have no idea. He was friendly.
Hey, you guys can adopt me.
Adopt you.
We can get a puppy
Puppy.
and a parrot.
Parrot.
I always wanted pets, but my mom said they're too messy.
Next up on this boring Wednesday is a song to get your blood pumping.
Yeah, don't get me started with pain after your poor writing, New Capcom. And isn't it weird how Leon goes from a more bleak individual in Resident Evil 2 OG to a more upbeat yet serious character in Resident Evil 4 OG, and it's now flip-flopped in the Remilk timeline, going from a goofy character in Resident Evil 2 Remilk to a pretty bleak and soulless character in Resident Evil 4 Remilk. What is up with New Capcom flipping things like that? That kind of flipping was in Resident Evil 2 Remilk, but that's best reserved for another retrospective. And relating back to Adam Benford, if New Capcom is not favoring the whole traumatized survivor persona for Resident Evil 4 Remilk Leon, why would they not add Adam Benford into this? Adam would have complemented this personality trait in Leon, and it would at least demonstrate that New Capcom is not afraid to incorporate lore from prior Resident Evil games into their remakes. And if they are going to remake each of the Resident Evil games up to Resident Evil 6, and Adam Benford is a crucial character in Resident Evil 6, given that he's the president during that game, then I feel it would have made sense to incorporate Adam Benford here. But returning to this introduction, the part where Leon says, this time it can be different, it has to? I don't understand what that's even related to. They don't follow up on that quote very well, and it's just mentioned out of nowhere when Leon is putting Ashley in that chair, like the developers thought the player would forget. Talk about slapdash writing.